and we will post this online so you can watch this later also. So again, thank you everyone for joining us. And Jared, let me move my thing. Jared, I'm going to turn the time over to you.
All right. Well, wonderful. Great to be here today. I'm going to start by just talking a little bit about, see if I can get this. How am I going? There we go. Talking a little bit about autism today. We're going to be talking about the lived experience. We're going to be talking about autism from the inside, but we're also going to be talking about tips and tools that are hopefully really practical and useful. I'm going to start though with a bit of the forest, kind of big picture stuff, and then we're going to narrow down to the trees because I think it'll give you a better context as you work with individuals with autism to be able to apply what you've learned and apply it effectively. So I want to share the thing that I first tell my students, and I've worked with literally hundreds of autistic teens and adults over the last 20 years. And one of the things I always try to drive home to them is that autism is not a tragedy, okay? That there's nothing inherently wrong with them. Their brain's just wired differently. They're not broken. They're not doomed. Life does get better. They're gonna have challenges. Some of those are gonna be pretty unique, but they're also gonna have great strengths. And some of those are gonna be unique. But they are enough just as they are, and they don't need to make themselves miserable and beat themselves up and constantly compare themselves to neurotypicals. The other thing is what I tell professionals when I'm working with professionals and parents. I read them this quote from Jim Sinclair, the guy on the right there, who's the founder of the Autistic Self-Advocacy Network. He said, "You didn't lose a child to autism. You lost a child because the child you waited for never came into existence. That isn't the fault of the autistic child who does exist. We need and deserve families who can see us and value us for ourselves, not families whose vision of us is obscured by the ghosts of children who never lived. Grieve if you must for your own lost dreams, but don't mourn for us." So often parents have to go through those stages of grief, and maybe professionals don't, but often professionals, again, see autism as a tragedy, something to be mourned, something that's terrible, something that you need to tell the parents that like, oh, they may never do this, they may never do that. And yeah, there are downsides to autism, and we're going to cover that. But it's not something that you need to tragedize, if that's a word. It's not a tragedy. There's great things, and we don't need to be mourned for, and I certainly don't need to be mourned for. I've had an amazing life, and we're not going to talk a ton about all of it, but I've gotten to go all over the nation. I've won all kinds of awards, but I was born on an island in Alaska, and now I get to direct a school here in Provo. I'm an adjunct at UVU. I'm on the Utah Autism Initiative. I'm the chair of the Utah Developmental Disabilities Council. I've helped with things all over the state. I've gone all over the nation talking about things, been working with autism for 20 years. And I'm an autistic adult. I've been living with autism for over 40 years. I have a child with autism. I have family members with autism. And honestly, I can tell you that for all of the challenges, I wouldn't trade the challenges of autism for the challenges of a quote unquote normal life, whatever the heck that is. So I'm excited to be here today. And I am a professional, but again, I'm talking about a fairly personal subject here. So even though I'm going to have my BCBA hat on sometimes, and even though I do have background in special ed and all of that, I'm going to be talking a lot from personal experience. And I'm going to be talking really quickly. I am not someone who's going to just read off all the slides. Like I said, you're going to get the slides, so you can read through them, you can watch all the videos, you can do all of that, but I'm going to move fairly quickly, and hopefully we'll have some time at the end here for questions as well. I am one person with autism. And people will say, like, Jared is an autism expert. And really, I'm an expert on my autism.
I'll turn mine down.
Anybody who tells you that they're an expert on all of autism, that's they're just trying to sell you something. I'm a specialist. I'm hopeful that this will be useful, though, because as you work with people on the spectrum, it's empowering if you can intervene based on an understanding of and an empathy for the actual lived experience of the autistic person. So I'm hoping to give you a little glimpse into the autistic mind today and teach you some of the vocabulary that you'll need. We're going to buzz right through the history because nobody wants to spend their lunch doing history, but we'll talk about the challenges of autism kind of from the inside and the trajectory of autism as people head into adulthood and transition. We'll also look at the strengths and cover some specific tips and tools and have hopefully some time for questions at the end. But if we don't, you're also welcome to always email me, and my email will be available widely with this. So we're going to talk about what it means to be a spectrum disorder. We're going to talk about all those neuro terms. what it means to be doubly discriminated, doubly disabled. And we're going to talk about high functioning versus low functioning, because this provides kind of a foundation to start talking about the lived experience of autism. First, I want to have a couple little side notes. Some people with autism prefer to be called people with autism, okay? Other people prefer to be called autistic. And I personally don't care. You'll hear me use them interchangeably, and a lot of autistics don't care. Some autistics, though, are very, very clear that they would rather be called autistic than a person with autism. And some people would rather be called a person with autism. And some people would rather you don't talk about their autism at all. So just like any other label, just like any other descriptor, any other pronoun, just talk to the person, ask them, what do they want to be called? There's nothing wrong with disability first language. So nothing wrong with being an autistic person, because it is very much not an accessory we carry around with us. It is how our brains are hardwired. And then a word on the puzzle piece. Again, autistics will tell me that, like, you can't use the puzzle piece, it's offensive. And I can totally get that. Personally, though, I don't mind, right? A puzzle is a wonderful picture that needs every piece to be complete. And everybody's trying to find their place in the overall picture, but it does get overused, and Autism Speaks kind of ruined it in some ways. But you'll see me use the puzzle piece too, and that's why I do. But just know that some people with autism, especially people who are autistic, don't like that. So that having been said, let's talk about what it means to be a spectrum. Part of it being a spectrum is that we've now taken a lot of former diagnoses that were in the DSM-4 and merged them together to make this autism spectrum in the DSM-5. And that's great for the purpose of insurance and lots of other things.
Is this?
If you have questions, if you can put them in the chat or save them to the end, that's going to be probably the most effective just for the size of the group. But Michael, if there's something really urgent, he'll handle that, he said. Hopefully most people are familiar with the actual DSM diagnostic criteria for autism. See there, symptoms must be present in early childhood, but may not become fully manifest until social demands exceed limited capacities. That was definitely my case. It was probably around age 11 or 12 where it really became obvious. Although if you knew what to look for, it was there from the beginning. So hopefully you know this, but from the inside, autism is basically struggling with verbal communication and nonverbal communication and connecting with other people and keeping those relationships going. Because we often make strange use of objects, words, sounds in our bodies, and we struggle with rituals and rigidity. We have hyper-focused interests and hyperactive or hypoactive, over or underactive senses. You should also know this one, right? What causes autism? And the answer is we don't know. We just don't. It's very complicated. There's definitely a genetic component, but we don't know. There is an interesting way to look at the spectrum that ironically, the Government Accounting Office came up with in a study that they did, and they just divided autism into these 5 components: these challenges with social impediments, communication, intense focus, sensory sensitivities, and routine and repetition. And what that allows you to do is to look at these spectrum graphs and say, oh, okay, this person, their intense focus and their rigid routines, that seems to be their biggest challenges. Whereas this person, they're having more problems with sensory sensitivities, and this person is probably non-speaking or non-verbal with the communication difficulties. And the bottom line is, as a spectrum, if you've met one person with autism, you've met one person with autism. It's very different. And a lot of people look at the spectrum as like, oh, high functioning on one end and low functioning on the other, when really it's more effective to look at it as a color wheel, that everybody's kind of got their own shade of autism. And of course, Temple Grandin's got a very unique shade. But autism is something where you can't tell just by looking. And one of the things that we get told a lot, especially if you're on kind of my side of the spectrum, where you don't necessarily, where you can fit in pretty easily with the neurotypicals, you get told, when I tell somebody I'm autistic, they're like, oh, well, you don't look autistic. And I don't know what that even means. Or they'll be like, oh, you're so normal. How could you be autistic? And I don't know if I'm supposed to be complimented by that. I was asking one of my students, like, what do you say when someone says you don't look autistic? And one girl raised her hand and she's like, I say, and you don't look stupid. And yet here we are. And I laughed and I was like, really? And she's like, no, I just think that in my head. But again, you can't tell just by looking. About a third of those on the spectrum are non-speaking. Okay, and so, but those who have the old diagnoses of Asperger's or PDD-NOS, those are the ones who might be on my side, where we're kind of hyperverbal. We talk a lot. And we have a higher communication ability, but that doesn't mean our social abilities are necessarily any higher. And so when I talk to people who have what used to be called high functioning autism. They struggle a lot with feeling misunderstood, connecting with others, feeling like an imposter, camouflaging. One of them said, I just have pathological loneliness. So being able to talk, again, might make it seem like the autism is mild, but that's not really a thing. If you are autistic, it's best to be able to meet other autistics, to realize that you've got a tribe. So I'm going to put in a quick plug there. Just in mid-May, May 13th, if you know anyone who's an adult with autism who wants to meet other autistics, have them look up AutCon. We do this convention every year at my school. It's a great 2 days. Come to a bunch of presentations put on by other autistic adults and learn stuff. It's there. Okay, so we've talked about the spectrum. Let's talk about what it means to be neurotypical, neurodivergent, neurodiverse, and so on and so forth. Neurotypical just means a brain, neuro, that is typical within the average range. Neurodivergent then would be, or neurodiverse is someone whose brain is different or diverges from the norm. Those whose brains are neurotypical, they're in the neuromajority because they're in those couple of iterations off the norm, and neurominorities are the small ones, right? I'm autistic, which means everyone around me has a disorder that makes them say things they don't mean, not care about structure, fail to hyperfocus on singularly important topics, have unreliable memories, drop weird hints, and creepily stare into my eyeballs. So why do people say you're the weird one? Because there's more of them than me. So when you're autistic, you are a minority. But all of the things that are seen as challenges for autism, if we were the majority, you could say those things about what are the so-called neurotypicals now. So when you have time and you get the slides, check this out. But I sat down with some friends and made a neurotypical syndrome, as this was a DSM entry. And there's a great video too, and you should totally watch it. But for time, we're not going to watch it. But just know that there's no blood test, there's no brain scan for autism. It is a list of symptoms, and it is definitely a different brain wiring. But just because the brain wiring is different doesn't mean it's necessarily a disability or has to be pathological. Doubly discriminated. This is something you'll hear about with autistics. Many of us are doubly discriminated against because might be part of a racial minority, and you can see the stats for that. Or they might be on the LGBT spectrum as well, and even then they might be discriminated against by other LGBTs. Gender, if you are a biological female with autism, you're probably actually going to get overlooked at first, and the age of diagnosis is much later, and it's assumed that females have a much lower rate of autism. And they'll often get diagnosed as ADHD or bipolar or sensory processing, some type of anxiety disorder, but not autism until much later. And so the average age for biological females is much, much, much older. And partly because there's this general ability with biological females to mask and camouflage the symptoms. And they also will tend to pick one of their special interests as socializing and trying to make friends and connect with others, which is very frustrating for them because even with that as a special interest, they're struggling, and partly because girls have a much, much, much higher social skills demand level. But there's a cultural bias against girls that makes it harder to diagnose them. They also tend to also be LGBT at a much higher rate and identify as that. They have much more complex dress and grooming requirements. So even again, if they're focusing on this, it's harder for them. They tend to be either really, really bluntly honest, or they might be really manipulative and dishonest. They tend to be really socially naive, which can make them sitting ducks for exploitation and abuse. They can develop really severe anxiety disorders because of the constant camouflaging. They tend toward behavioral extremes, more vulnerable toward suicide, even than males with autism. And autistic males are still higher rates of suicidality than neurotypicals. And then eating disorders are incredibly common in biological females with autism. And this is really sad. But the bottom line is that don't overlook biological females who may very well have an autism spectrum disorder. So hopefully, again, some of the stuff we'll talk about today will help you. And if you don't know this female with autism, you should know Temple Grandin, because Temple, and if you don't know her story, again, watch the movie, but she's one of the first diagnosed cases of autism, and one of the first ones to help people see that people with autism actually had an active inner world and actually had an imagination and actually could empathize with people and with animals. And she's an animal science professor to this day in Colorado. And all of us on the spectrum owe her big time. Love Temple. And she says, though, that it was just critically important for her to have mentors in her life, that people would expose her to lots of new things and new experiences, that they would give her choices, but that they would also prepare her for changes. And that they would also give her very solid expectations that just because she was autistic didn't mean she could get out of being polite or get out of, have to be allowed to isolate all the time. So she talks a lot about the loving push and how we have to just keep moving forward, and how as we get moving forward, autism does get better. Again, if you have time, watch this video. This is Amy Gravino and Women on the Spectrum talking about from the inside what it's like to be a biological female with autism. And again, great insights there. So you should watch that. So on top of being doubly discriminated against, a lot of people with autism are doubly disabled because autism tends to not come alone. Neurodiversity is like a great big family and everybody's got pieces of it. So those with autism often also have ADHD, often have some type of allergies, whether that's food allergies or seasonal allergies, eating disorders and digestive disorders, learning disabilities like dyslexia, dyscalculia, mood disorders like depression or anger, anxiety disorders, motor problems, trauma disorders, sleep disorders, higher suicidality as we've discussed, and even Tourette's is much higher on the autism spectrum. So autism generally doesn't come alone, and don't let there be a whole lot of diagnostic overshadowing. Remember that these also will need to be addressed and can be addressed separately. Okay, term number 5, low functioning and high functioning. Compared to what, as Nick Walker says? Like, who gets to determine what functioning is? And if someone looked at me at different times, only one aspect of my life was considered I could be thought of as high or low. People are like, oh, you're so high functioning. And then it's like this afternoon, I'm dreading having to drive a couple blocks to the dentist because I hate driving. It's just, I'm not a functional driver. So again, the worst thing about being told you have high functioning autism is people think, oh, your autism is mild, but it still creates all kinds of problems. They just might be unique. So rather than saying high or low functioning, talking about high supports or low supports, or high communication ability or low communication ability, those kind of things can be helpful. All right, like I said, I'm going to buzz right through the history here, but some of it's really critically important just for background. The story of autism has not been super great. Over time, we've been really ostracized, stigmatized, institutionalized, infantilized, and sadly eugenicized. And to this day, if you go to the Judge Rotenberg School, you'll still see autistics with electric shock collars on who are still shocked if they have behavioral issues. Again, there used to be a lot of push to sterilize people with autism. In the 1930s, though, is when the official, and with other disabilities too, but in the 1930s is when you really have autism start off. You have Dr. Connor, who comes up with the phrase autism as he meets a young man named Donald Triplett. And Donald is the first diagnosed case of autism. He was 5 years old. He was in an insane asylum. He'd been in there since he was 3 because he was autistic, and he had all of the classic autism symptoms because autism, the diagnosis, is based on Donald and Donald's behaviors. And so this is when autism story officially begins, is in 1938 there. We'll come back to Donald. In the 40s, things got even worse, although Dr. Hans Asperger, where Asperger syndrome comes from, was a Nazi scientist who did start the idea of high functioning autism. Again, I hate that term, but it's there. In the 60s, with the civil rights movement, disability rights started being included. And in the 70s and 80s, there were laws passed that finally started giving people with autism and other disabilities rights. And Temple Grandin started talking out, and Jennifer Keelan did the Capitol Crawl campaign, going up and down the steps to get disability rights and curb cuts. And the ADA finally got passed in 1990. And so things have gotten a little better, but they're still not great. Now, all throughout this time period, autism rates kept going up and up and up. And as of this year, 1 in 44 Americans are autistic. And it's estimated that over 2% of people worldwide, probably about 2.5% of people, are on the autism spectrum. Part of that is just people who've been always underdiagnosed. Part of that is there may be an increase in rates in some ways. The response to that increase in autism has been really mixed. Some of it's been positive, but a lot of it's been really, really negative. There have been horrible ransom note campaigns talking about how autism has captured your child and is destroying his life and his ability. I'm not going to show you this video, but it's horribly offensive as Autism Speaks talks about, I am autism and all the horrible things autism will do to you and your family. And again, Autism Speaks is the reason that a lot of autistics don't want to be associated with a puzzle piece. And you'll see t-shirts that'll say like, Autism Speaks doesn't speak for me. So watch that video when you get a chance. They finally started World Autism Awareness Day in the early 2000s, but it was still very much, look at the the ravages of this disease. It's an equal opportunity destroyer. They put out all these empty child strollers in Central Park to represent it. It was terrible. And as Zoe Gross says, as long as people prefer to think of autism as a kidnapper, a killer, a barrier, or an opposing army, as opposed to merely just another aspect of personhood, autistic people will never be truly accepted. Because what we don't really need is awareness. It's great, but we need acceptance, right? BYU is aware of the University of Utah, okay? University of Utah is aware of BYU, but we need acceptance there, right? Awareness can help lead to acceptance though, and acceptance can lead us to advocacy and self-advocacy, which can eventually help us with our self-discipline and self-esteem, our self-governance. But let's get started looking at this because things are still not great, okay? Last year, Lynn and Cameron got shot in Salt Lake for being an autistic kid having a meltdown. Shot 11 times. The good news is now because of that, there are laws passed that are requiring first responder trainings in Utah for firefighters and for police officers. UVU is doing a great job helping train with this as well. And again, things are getting better, but things are also getting better because a lot more people with neurodiversities are speaking out. And Elon Musk saying, yeah, I've got Asperger's syndrome. And Anthony Hopkins talks about how he got diagnosed in his 70s and so on and so forth. You've got Miss Americas and you've got business leaders who are saying, yeah, I'm autistic and it's okay. And just a couple of years ago, a documentary film crew went back down to Mississippi, Forest, Mississippi, and tracked down Donald Triplett. He's still alive, Mr. First Case of Autism. This is him today. He's in his 80s. And this is Donald without any early interventions that we would normally consider. Donald graduated high school. Donald graduated college. And Donald was an active frat member. He never did get married, right? But he is a retired bank teller and he lives on his own, which a lot of 80-year-olds can't say. And he got a cell phone in his 70s and he loves sending texts to his town. And he golfs and he drives and he travels the world and he does this all himself. And notice he was very delayed in reaching these skills. And he still has a very rigid routine and an awkward golf stroke and is isolated a lot. But his whole town supports him and loves him and accepts his idiosyncrasies. And again, there's a great documentary about Donald being put together by my friend Karen Zucker, and that'll be coming out soon. It's called In a Different Key, and you should totally watch it. How did Donald do it? Well, when they took him out of the insane asylum, they put him with a foster family on a farm. And he learned to work and he learned to use his routines to improve himself. He had clear, challenging goals. He had surrounded himself with people who accepted and admired him. He was able to self-advocate. When they found his yearbook, they found that he'd written in everybody else's yearbooks, he wrote, "I wish you luck." When they found his yearbook, he'd written, "I wish myself luck." And again, I wish all of us luck as we work with people with autism. So let's take the rest of this time and really dig down, having looked at like the big broad picture. Let's start looking at a way to see the symptoms and challenges a little differently and actually start looking at the strengths and to realize that autism is a developmental delay, to stop worrying about normal and start worrying about how do we maximize this person's potential and to find some tools for maximizing. Okay, let's do that. Woohoo, Autistics Unite. Oh, right, like we're gonna hold hands. Okay, so one great rule of thumb, which is super helpful, regardless of anybody with autism I found, is to look at autism as a disorder of extremes. Again, that normal range and a couple standard deviations off that is what normal is. So people with autism on any characteristic are basically outliers. And so it's kind of a disorder of extremes, and it can be extremes at the same time. So when you look at something like speech and language issues, these are little kids who didn't talk for a long time and often didn't talk till they were 6 or 7, like Albert Einstein, or advanced development like me, where we talked early and we haven't shut up since, okay? Or we have too much or too little detail, or we're sharing too much or too little with others, or we talk a lot around some people, but we're selectively mute around others, like my sister with autism. Or we repeat things over and over. And with my type of autism, it just means I can quote all of Monty Python and the Holy Grail or whatever that is. But, we may talk to ourselves. We may have some strange voice characteristics or sound kind of robotic. All of these things are extremes. Those of us who talk a lot, when we start talking, we want to download that whole file. And those of us like my sister, when we aren't talking much, they're very comfortable with silence and very conscious that others might be uncomfortable with it, but it's not bad. If they're silent, it means they're feeling all right with you. Cognitive issues, right? Again, we tend to think of things are all or nothing, black and white. We are very, very strong in our opinions, let's just say, and in our politics, our fandoms, or our ideas of right and wrong. We tend to be very psychologically rigid, which is why it's really important to learn skills to be more psychologically flexible. We tend to be really over or under conscious of mistakes or importance, over or under rational, right? So my son with autism, he'll be the one where we're like, we'll say, and you'll feel it in your heart. And he'll be like, well, actually the heart is an organ that pumps blood through the body and distributes nutrition and has nothing whatsoever to do with emotion. And we'll be like, yes, fine, but this, we're talking about the metaphorical heart. And this same son who's super hyper rational there, I was talking to him the other day. I'm like, okay, dude, you're 17. Can we like get rid of or donate or sell your old Lightning McQueen cars collection? And he's like, well, no, that would hurt their feelings. So anyway, that's very much that way as well. And the same with attention. We tend to have no ability to really muster anything but indifference and apathy, or we care 110%. And if we can't care 110%, we're going to probably not be able to care about that at all. Again, we tend to be very detail oriented. Autism is finding the needle before noticing the haystack. So ADHD tends to be very big picture. Autism tends to be very, very small picture. Another rule of extremes, sensory issues. Our senses tend to be either really, really not enough or really, really too high. And this is where stimming comes from, a lot of the overload, a lot of the meltdowns, the shutdowns, things like touch, taste, smell, proprioception, a lot of the touch senses and the pressure senses, and even things like temperature are really a big deal. My friend Danny Reedy talks about the sensory funnel and how the sensory issues are really often what creates all the other problems. So if you're working with someone with autism, the best place to start is number one there, down at the bottom, sensory. Address the sensory and biological stuff first, and you'll find it's a lot easier to get into the other things, because autism is a disorder of overwhelm, right? And again, if you take a neurotypical and completely overwhelm them, they'll exhibit autistic symptoms, because this is just how humans are wired. Why do we stim? Well, we stim because it helps us to add some extra or take away too much sensory input. So unless it's dangerous or illegal or totally socially unacceptable, just let us stim, or help us find ways to stim that might be a little more socially appropriate. But think of replacement rather than extinction. Okay, we help us learn to stim to increase if we're like not paying attention enough, or we're not getting enough of a certain sense. Help us also to learn to stim in a way that isn't going to disturb others or detract from a lesson. So it's not good to be stimming with your eyes or your ears when you should be paying attention to what you're seeing and hearing. Sensory overlap is another weird thing. Synesthesia and so forth is common with autism. And autism, according to my friend Shannon, is hearing better when you wear glasses with tinted lenses. And he literally does. I remember I could not hear well when I was wearing a mask during COVID. And it wasn't just because the other person was wearing a mask. It was weird. Autism is feeling physical pain when you come in from the hot outdoors to an air-conditioned room. And I can tell you stories about this, being from Alaska and coming to Utah early in my marriage. I would just walk in the door and my wife would want to hug me and I'd push her away because it just was painful and I needed to calm down first. Other challenges, again, extremes of motor and musculature. We tend to be either really clumsy and have problems with the motor skills, or very, very good motor skills in that area. So I had very good fine motor skills for drawing and writing, but you throw me a ball, I will drop that ball. Okay? I do not have full body movement. I cannot dance. I never will. Overly loose or tight muscle tone. These are the kids that really struggle to learn to swim, learn to ride a bike, or maybe never do. There are also the kids who can sit full lotus without ever having to stretch. It's odd. Autism is ruining your perfect GPA because of the stupid PE credit requirements for graduation. Autism is being hugely relieved when people give up trying to teach you to ride a bike or swim because you took so long and failed so badly at it. A lot of coordination issues there. Emotional issues too. Again, extremes. We can't just be a little sad or a little angry or a little happy. We're going to flap. We're going to show you we're feeling great. We have trouble predicting or understanding other people's emotion or our own. This is called alexithymia. Trouble with communicating emotion, especially in the right dosage or in the right time. We may respond really wrong, people would think, to some really powerful emotional news, like someone passing away or a tragedy like that. And we tend to either really hyper empathize, like totally overfeel what the other person is feeling, or we kind of try to shut that off and don't even notice what the other person is. Yeah, and then the flat affect there that Spock is wondering. Logic often trumps emotion for us, right? So autism is reporting on a group of missing hikers and predicting they're definitely dead. If you haven't had a chance to go watch the old Onion show on YouTube, they used to have a news show and they had an autistic reporter. They'd be like, we'll bring you now to autistic reporter Michael Falk. Another one he did, autism is reporting on a train accident, asking if the train is okay. That's great. Autism is collecting toys and counting toys as friends. We often have emotional attachment to objects. So even if we're not hoarders, we may look like it, or we may have really huge collections, but our objects are important to us. And so sometimes having to thank that object and emotionally break with that object before I can get rid of it is interestingly a part of autism. Social issues too, again, the extremes. Our social emotional age doesn't usually match our chronological age, and more on that later, but we may like things that are things people much younger than us like, or much older than us like. Our verbal and nonverbal messages often don't match. We'll appear overly withdrawn or overly excited, or we'll have no facial expression or too much expression, or we'll have the right expression, but it's the wrong timing, it's delayed. Eye contact obviously is classic. We have problems with eye contact. A lot of times we're getting too much sensory information from other people's eyes. So we'll tell people, hey, I can either listen to you or I can look at you, but I can't really do both. Our hygiene and grooming issues, which are usually related to sensory. I couldn't really shower till I was in my 20s because it just hurt to have water on my face and my ears. So being able to fully shower and shampoo took me into my 20s. And so that can create social issues too if you're not really hygienic. I did shower today. If you guys could all smell me through the Zoom, you'd appreciate it. And we don't like to make small talk. We like big talk. We don't see the point of small talks. That's something I work on with people. We also tend to specialize in lots of things, but not social skills. And again, the exception to this is biological females. They'll often pick that category. But again, guys will be like, well, but I could care about sci-fi and fantasy. Why, or Pokemon? Why would I care about social skills? Autism is calling in sick when there's a staff retreat. And it took me years before I really could come to the staff Christmas party and stuff, or saw any point to that. This is still me today. So there's a lot of challenges with autism. Okay, but as Dr. Tony Atwood says in his great book, The Complete Guide to Asperger's Syndrome, professionals and service agencies tend to see children and adults with autism spectrum disorders who are having problems that are highly conspicuous and difficult to treat or resolve. And this may lead to an overly pessimistic view of the long-term outcome. And that's what I want to close with, is talking about strengths and what we can do to bring those out. Because autism has a ton of strengths, and we get overly pessimistic looking at little kids and saying, oh, they're developmentally delayed. But autism has been shown in the research to have amazing learning and memory abilities, visual and auditory processing abilities in our areas of special interest. Not necessarily in other areas, but in those. We also tend to be able to focus for much longer periods of time than neurotypicals, to make more logical, deductive decisions if we have the right information. We also tend to be highly creative, really good with mazes, word games, puzzles, math problems, to thrive on routines, to be good with music. We're more likely to be savants. We tend to be really honest and really empathetic for kids and animals and the environment and people that are in our family. Deeply curious, idealistic, often natural leaders, although with some communication issues. Looking at you, Ronald Reagan. Perfectionistic, and we tend to be exceptionally good, and this one's almost universal. People with autism are really good with creating systems. So teach them systems and how to create systems and how to navigate systems. You'll have so much more success. Give them systems. We talked about these specialty slots being a weakness. Well, they're also a strength because we can hyper-focus in these areas of special interest. And yeah, we're really, really good at it. Now, sometimes it can go awry, like with screens, if our hyper-focus is just screens. But like Temple Grandin said, if we're exposed to lots of other stuff, we can learn to hyper-focus on other things. And one of my special interests now is autism, which is great because I get to do this all over the world. Autism is not hearing your name called over the sound of the book you're reading. This was me as a kid. Get into that thing and we perseverate. Specialization also means that we're going to have outlier jobs. If you look at people who have those jobs that nobody else gets, a lot of them are neurodiverse, and autism is no exception. So I call this the Walmart cluster, and not just because a lot of really awesome adults with autism work at Walmart. These are writers like Nobel or Pulitzer Prize winner Tim Page, or actors like Oscar winner Anthony Hopkins, or leisure and recreational people like world champion soccer player Lionel Messi or Satoshi Tajiri, who invented Pokemon. Musicians like Derek Parvashini, the Human iPod, or artists like Stephen Wiltshire, the Living Camera, or research and educational people like Nobel Prize winner Vernon Smith, and tons of computer programmers and history professors and accountants and doctors, engineers, lawyers, any kind of highly niche, highly systematized career, you're going to find a lot of autistics there. And in areas with high tech employment like Silicon Valley or Silicon Slopes, you're going to have higher rates of autism according to research. The bottom line is that neurodiversity has strengths. It may be every bit as crucial for the human race as biodiversity is for life in general, okay? Recent data suggests it's time to start thinking of autism as an advantage in some spheres, not across the bear, says Dr. Montron in the University of Montreal. Research strengths, not just autism, but all neurodiversities are associated with heightened creativity, because again, and unique learning, because the brain is uniquely wired. They tend to have amazing focus and vision that neurotypicals miss, be more resilient because of what they've experienced, and to be able to contribute in very unique and powerful ways. And again, looking at you, Steve Jobs and Bill Gates and Elon Musk and so many others. Very briefly going through some of the research that has been going on the last 20 years, and it's showing that autism is a developmental delay, that over time it gets better and the brain functions get better. Every single autistic characteristic and challenge gets better with age. And I'm so much better in my 40s than I ever was when I was 4 or 14. And guess what? Neurotypicals do too. They just don't, they would develop more quickly than autism. There's a good rule of thumb, which is the rule of 2/3. This is not a hard and fast rule. It is a rule of thumb. And basically that if the autistic person you're working with, socially, emotionally, they're probably about 2/3 of their chronological age, okay? Not in other types of development, and physically they're not delayed. And this doesn't mean that they're, you know, a 12-year-old in an 18-year-old's body. What this means is that they're probably going to be behind their peers for a bit. But what it does mean is that you're going to see most of the growth for someone with autism between the ages of 20 and 30, because that's basically those ages of 13 to 20. And thankfully, thanks to the rule of 2/3, I'm just entering my 30s now. Other things they found, when you get out of school, the symptoms tend to improve because K-12 is not a good match for autism. When I was a child, I was ostracized by my peers, mostly for using words like ostracized. We also are better socially as adults. We have broader interests. Our brains are more socially adept. We can mask better if we need to. We have more topics we're able to talk about. And online or at work, we can find social groups. What they're also finding is about 1 in 7 people with autism get married. And Temple's like, people worry too much about social life with an adult with autism. We'll make friends, we will, and we'll keep learning and we'll keep getting better. Now, not everything gets better. I can tell you the story. I was flown down to Washington, D.C. to go chat with our Utah delegation of reps and senators by the Utah Developmental Disabilities Council a couple of years ago. And I used all my systems and I got in that hotel and got on the plane, flew there, unpacked. Next day, I'm going to the conference, and the conference center was at the Renaissance Hotel in downtown DC. And I walked in and I was feeling so good. I'm like, they're not even going to know I'm autistic. And this was the carpet. And you can't not possibly appreciate how awful this carpet is. I could not walk. It felt like I was like on the ocean. I was like about to topple over, and I had to learn to carry my binder and just not look down. So not everything gets better. And I still have meltdowns, and I still have things that I'm not super functional in. And guess what? Everybody's life has challenges, and normal is not the goal. So we need to give up this idea about normal. There's no such thing. Be your best self and learn to love it. Is normal ever a good goal? Well, yeah. I mean, if you're looking at meaningful cultural norms, but let the autistic person help you decide, are they going to go for these things? Because does everybody get a college education? Does everybody have a career? Or does everybody date? Does everybody who date gets married? Does everybody who gets married and have children, do they stay married? No, I mean, everybody's different. So if they want these goals for themselves, great, help them, we'll go for it, but don't worry about those, and they'll get there when they get there. The goal shouldn't be to normalize the person, but to maximize them. Normalization says the disability is wrong, that's broken, it's something to get rid of. Normalization wants them to just totally match and look like every other person. Maximization says, hey, your brain's wired differently. You're a unique and amazing person. Where do you want to go? And it says, how do we maximize and actualize this person's capabilities as a disabled person? Normalization says, how can I become the best approximation of everyone else? Which frankly is overwhelming and terrifying and not very encouraging or positive as an experience. Whereas maximization says, how can I become my best self and achieve my best future? And that is what we want for people. So in your practice, aim for maximization. ASD, autism spectrum disorder, could just as well stand for anxiety, stress, and defense modes. Don't neglect these. Watch for diagnostic overshadowing. Often it's like, oh, well, they have autism, that's why that's happening. But there's so many other things going on, and anxiety disorder shouldn't be overlooked, because when we have our bodies in a constant fight or flight state, it can create a lot of long-term issues. And so a lot of people with autism end up with gastrointestinal problems, and that can be gastroparesis like I have, or this can be Crohn's disease or ulcerative colitis. Autoimmune disorders like Crohn's and like lupus and like rheumatoid arthritis are really common with autism. And so are trauma disorders and severe anxiety disorders. So don't overlook these. These also need to be treated. And in fact, as an adult, a lot of times these are the big things to treat, not the autism. If you're finding the person melting down or really going into defense mode and trying to withdraw, it's because they're being overwhelmed. It's usually between the environment, what's going on in the environment. So 5 steps here: recognize the autism. Oh, okay, they're starting to get overwhelmed. This is their autism. They're being overwhelmed. Do what you can to reduce that overwhelm. Okay, whether that's emotional or physical or environmental or social. And then allow them to retreat and recharge, kind of go to some space where they can be by themselves for a bit. Give them some time and then reach out respectfully. It could be just sending them a text and, hey, are you ready to talk? Are you good? And then when they're ready, help them redirect, reframe, and come up with the tools to keep doing this. Again, this is from my friend Danny Reedy. Another rule of thumb that's a good tip: the double empathy problem. Neurotypicals always assume that if there's a problem, it's the autistic's fault and it must be the autism. So if the autistic can't understand the neurotypical, it's because the autistic has empathy deficits and communication skills. And if the neurotypical can't understand the autistic, it's because the autistic has empathy deficits and poor communication skills. So you're darned if you do and darned if you don't. This is called the double empathy problem, when really, again, neurotypicals, you're the ones that are supposed to be all flexible. Be flexible and learn the social skills and learn to connect with the autistic person and relate to them in their world. Here's some tips. When you're talking with us, respect our accommodations. If I might be not looking in your eyes, I might be wearing headphones. Consider the timing from our point of view. Okay, if I'm getting ready to go do something else and I'm fixated on that, it's probably not a good time to talk. Consider the setting. Is there too much going on? Minimize sensory overload when you're going to talk to us, and we can pay attention to you better. Don't require eye contact. Don't take our silence personally if we talk or don't. Don't freak out about our nonverbals, which may be not what you're used to. Try to sincerely connect to our interests and strengths. Even little kids with autism, they've got those special interests and strengths, and connect with that. Allow us space and time to process and comment. So only ask one question at a time and finish that before you move on. Try to stick with that topic. Don't make a lot of multiple requests. And please, please, please try to prepare us for any changes or surprises. We're not very good at that. And to this day, my daughter will say, like, I don't like giving you gifts because you're the worst at like showing any kind of surprise or appreciation. And it's there. And again, don't say you don't look autistic. When you're talking with little kids, instead of talking about them as if they're not in the room, remember that the person can hear you and assume that they can understand you, even if they're nonverbal. And instead of assuming that autism is the defining characteristic of their character, remember everybody's unique and autism is just one part of them. Instead, believing that being autistic makes them less reliable, remember that that's your bias. And a lot of times they can see things you can't. And if they're saying they're getting bullied or abused or uncomfortable, you got to take that seriously. And instead of allowing the world to teach them that their autism is a bad thing, tackle the problem head on, help them learn systems and learn how awesome they are. Remind them that they are awesome. And instead of loving the child, but hating the autism, just love the child. If you're dealing with inappropriate behaviors, this is my system here. Deal with it. Determine the context. What was going on? What are the antecedents? What are the consequences? What's the pattern here? What was the sensory and biological setting? What were they trying to accomplish? Now, once you've determined the context, move on to explore, well, what happened then in that context? What caused it? Was it a sensory or a biological thing? Was it a comprehension issue? Did they not get the social context? And finally, use all of your best strategies to alleviate the behavior because they want to do better too, right? Whatever that may be. Help them find ways to communicate that. And final tip on this one, always assume the person you're working with is doing their very best under the circumstances, because we're trying. We really want to please. A couple last tools. We got to pace ourselves. This is not a sprint. So make sure that you got the marathon mindset, okay? P tools are things like purpose. Always make sure we understand why we're doing the thing. Prime us, make sure we're prepared for it, that it's predictable, that you're patient with us. Antecedents, make sure you're taking care of things before we even start being asked to act or that we might melt down. Maximize our autonomy and our choices. Give us aids and systems and build affinity with us. Show us how to make friendships and have social interactions. Be consistent and clear, have clear consequences, but be compassionate too, and never punish the autism. Environmental modifications. Work on the environment at least as hard as you work on the person. Give us tools for executive functioning supports, expose us to lots of things, and celebrate our exceptionality because there's a lot of awesome things too. Concluding, again, autism's not a death sentence. Doesn't go away, but it does tend to get better over time. And the funny thing about little kids with autism is they grow up to be adults with autism. So help us to build those skills, to get resilient, to avoid isolation, customize the interventions. Don't just say, oh, they're autistic, so we do A, B, and C. No, everybody's autism is a little different flavor, a little different shade. Help us to have those unique ones because there's no one size fits all. And I say that as an ABA practitioner, and I love ABA, and I know a lot of autistics hate it, but that's because it was done wrong with them. But is ABA the only thing? No. And is it the only thing you can use with people? No. Find the right interventions for them. And be flexible. You guys all need to work on your flexibility too, and let us live our best lives. Remember, we're not our autism, okay? Even if we are identifying as disability first, autism is just part of us, just like any other identity aspect. And we're gonna have good days, bad days, and everything in between. Times where we're thrilled to be autistic and our autism is real positive. Times where kind of wish it would go away. But guess what? Everybody has these ups and the downs. Just because we might have a more extreme, we're still just like everybody else. And if you can't fix our autism, or you wouldn't even want to, because why? At least try to accept, acknowledge, and celebrate the uniqueness that we can add to the world and help us to start seeing it in more of a positive rather than being punished for stepping outside of that box of normality, whatever the heck that is. Value the lived experience of the people with the neurodiversity. Some suggested resources here, some books you might want to read, some intervention ones as well. There's so many out there that are also lived experience, talks you can hear online, or biographies and autobiographies you can pick up. There's some great ones out there. Highly, highly, highly encourage them. And I know I flew through this, but I wanted to leave time for questions. So guys, we made it through 109 slides in 50 minutes. So congrats. I'd love to go ahead and take some questions now. And again, I'm happy to talk more in depth about anything we talked about or cover things that we didn't cover. Literally, go ahead, feel free to ask me anything. And thanks again so much for inviting me today.
Savannah, do you want to ask your question there? Oh, she doesn't have a mic. Okay. Savannah says, she says, this is such good information. I am so curious to know your thoughts about the differences, the overlap between autism, ADHD for better diagnosis and treatment for both. I see so much overlap in these types of neurodiversity.
Wonderful. And that's the word. Okay. So if you imagine neurodiversity is kind of like this great big metropolis, this huge city called neurodiversity, probably the biggest chunk of that city is actually anxiety and depression, because these are differences in brain wiring and it actually has a lot of overlap with these others. But the biggest like traditional neurodiversity you're going to find in there is learning disabilities, processing disorders. Okay, so these are like speech and language disorders. These are like dyslexia, dysgraphia, dyscalculia, dyspraxia, that kind of stuff. And that's about 10% of the population has that, whereas about 20 to 50 has anxiety and depression. It's all over the place. I don't know what happened the last couple of years to blow that out, but something happened. So about 10% of people have kind of learning disabilities, and this overlaps heavily because about 5% of people have ADHD and about 2.5% of people are on the autism spectrum. So it's almost as if ADHD is kind of its own little suburb of the neurodiversity city, and autism may be a subgroup of ADHD, or it might be another suburb that kind of has a really fuzzy boundary. So let me give you a couple of things, and if you're interested, email me at that email address you see on the screen. I will send you my differential diagnostic for ADHD and autism, but really, and I don't diagnose, this is just me giving advice to therapists. But ADHD, one of the big differences between ADHD and autism, probably the fundamental difference, is that ADHD tends to respond to medication and autism doesn't have a medication that it responds to very well. Other things you're going to see, ADHD, they will forgive and forget. They'll tick you off or they'll get offended, they'll blow up. And then they're like, I don't even remember why I'm mad at you. And they just, whatever. They don't have the attention span or the energy. Autism can hold a grudge forever and ever and ever. And I can tell you a million stories. But that's one of the big ones. Otherwise, there's a lot of things that look more like ADHD or more like autism, but could be either. And as of the DSM-5, it is possible to have both. And I would say about a third of ADHD people probably have autism, and probably around half of autistics have ADHD, something like that. I mean, these are really, really general numbers, but hopefully that's helpful. Again, I have a whole presentation on autism and ADHD. If you email me, I'll send you what I got.
Jared, how do you work with parents that refuse to accept autism in their child? And with that, that was one question. And another was a son graduating from high school can tell he's overwhelmed with the future. How do you navigate the big changes?
Awesome.
Those two are probably both can be together.
Remember, when you're working with a child with autism, that the one thing we do know about autism is that these genetics, autism is about 90% genetics. So that's higher than almost anything. So that means there is a 90% chance that at least one of their parents is on the spectrum. So there's probably an undiagnosed autism there. And again, then admitting that their child has autism is going to be harder for them if they haven't accepted that diagnosis themselves. And a lot of parents get diagnosed after their kids get diagnosed. So as you're talking with those parents, again, come in with the positives. Come in talking to them about very successful autistics who are out there. And there are so many of them, and you can see them now. Come in and talk about the strengths and the special abilities and say, oh, I'm so excited to see what your kids' special abilities are going to be. And oh, okay, yeah, they're going to have some issues here, but this isn't a disorder so much as it's just a different brain wiring. And if we can make sure that we're addressing that, we're going to do it. And then if they still don't want the label or they can't accept the label is just a bunch of symptoms. Pick a symptom that they do agree with. Well, yeah, would at least like our child to be able to talk, or we would at least like our child to be able to potty train. Focus on that, and then you'll probably get a lot more opening. The second part of that was how to prepare people for the big changes. I've, again, spent my whole life, my professional life, working with the transition stage, that kind of 16 to 36 kind of range of autism, although I've worked outside of that too. And like any big change, you've got to prime them for it. So with my son with autism, which I didn't even know he had autism at first, but from the time he's old enough to talk and walk and everything, I've been telling him, hey, when you're 18, you're going to be out of the house unless you're in college, actively going to classes, or your, papers are in for an LDS mission. Otherwise, you're not in my house. But we've always helped prime him and said, oh, we're going to be supportive and this is going to be exciting. But remember, it's a developmental delay. So when they're 18, they're 12 in a lot of ways. Not in all ways. In some ways, they're probably 50. But in a lot of ways, they're 12. And so that's a big deal for a 12-year-old to go leave home and all that kind of stuff. So try it gradually. Try to, again, prepare them for this. Start talking about transition very early. Just having the expectation of transition, according to the Vanderbilt research, makes them 5 times more likely to successfully transition. But also tell them stories about people who kind of failed to transition and talk about the differences there. Help them come up with a unique plan for that. And again, expose them to lots of stuff. Bring them around, help them see what future places to live might look like. Bring them to Scenic View. We'll give you a free tour. They can spend the night here. They can do some stuff there too. There's lots of stuff out there, but helping them to see what their options might look like and help them find something they could be excited with, but then break it down to really, really small pieces. I could talk about that all day. Again, email me. I'll send you some more transition stuff too. But anything else? I know we're running out of time.
Well, let me first, just in case, because there's always a lot that have to jump off.
Give them the code word.
Yeah, let's get the code word out there. The code word, here we go. I'm going to steal the screen from you. So the code word is the autism 426. And then I put the link in the meeting or in the chat. Let me copy it again. If you cannot get on that link, if you're on your phone or can't see the chat or anything, if you will email me and I will send you the link, and then you can get on that. I do know we are still having issues with firewalls, so email me and I'll send you the link, and you can get on that. It is a Google form, so that's why we're having the issues with the firewalls. But I hope you all can get on that. Let me know if you're having an issue, but that link's in the chat, and just use that, that code word. My email. Oh, sorry, I can't see on my screen here. So let me shrink that. My email, if a lot of you have, you received the invite and the Zoom link, you can access it that way. But there is also my email, Michael Dinsmore at uhsinc.com. And, or you can just reply to the invite for this class. We can go back through and answer some questions. I apologize. I do know I'll end up missing them because I saw that we've now gone up the thing. Somebody asked how do you test? And I probably am, okay. How does one go about getting diagnosed with autism? Are there pros and cons with being officially diagnosed?
Yeah, so great question. I made it through college, my first bachelor's degree, without being diagnosed, and actually got into the special education field, and long story short, found out that way about Asperger's syndrome and some of this stuff. So I was like, oh, that sounds a lot like me, but I don't need the services anymore. And so I'll just learn from this, and I don't need the diagnosis, and that's fine. Again, the diagnosis should be if you want the services, or if you really, really, really want to be an advocate for the identity. Otherwise, there's not really a point in getting the diagnosis. So if you don't need the services and accommodations, or if you don't really want to be a part of like the autism pride movement and that kind of stuff, then you probably don't need it. If you do want the diagnosis though, because you want the services, or you might need Social Security or whatever, then the best thing to do is to find a therapist who specializes in autism. So there's a clinic up at the U. We have a clinic at my school. There used to be one at BYU, but Michael South just moved. I think they do still have a clinic there. So a lot of the colleges can help you. Some of the local LCSWs and so forth can as well. And so look into that. What you want is somebody who has experiences, especially if you're getting diagnosed as an adult. You're going to want someone with a lot of experience with adult autism because it looks really different than childhood autism. But they're getting better at it. A lot of the tests that will be administered are things like the ADOS, those kind of things. And then if you don't get the answer you want, go to somebody else. It was scary for me when I finally went in to get officially diagnosed. I literally had a whole presentation because I love presentations, and I had a whole presentation plan to try and talk to him about my autism. And yeah, about 5-10 minutes into my presentation, because they're like, well, so what brings you here today? They were like, okay, whoa, you have autism, now let's talk. But it was good, and I cried because it was a huge relief for me to just have kind of a hook to hang all of my experiences on, and to really be able to say, yeah, this makes so much more sense than the other things I'd told about myself and the labels I put on myself. So great question. Anything else?
I'm going to steal you for a second here. If you have questions, Jared did say, and I'll give Jared, if you want to share your side again, Jared said to email him if you do have questions and want to talk. So if you're looking for a copy of the slides and the recording, fill out that certificate, even if you don't need the certificate, because that'll give me the emails that you're looking for, that everybody that I can send it to. And I will send the slides and the recording and your certificate in an email. I think those that quite a few of you have already experienced and know exactly how we do that. Again, I know people are jumping off, so thank you so much for attending. We will stay here and answer a few more questions as we scroll up, or if someone wants to hurry and unmic and hurry and ask, we can ask that.
We got 3 more minutes, so yeah.
Okay.
And then yeah, just email me. I can't get my screen to share, but
okay. What I'll do is I'll just send, if you'll fill out that certificate, I'll just attach your email there too. So
Yeah,
we'll have,
great.
you can contact
And
Jared.
it'll be on the
afterwards.
slides when you get the slides.
That's
So.
true too. It is
You
on
can
those
also look
slides
me up
also.
online. I'm not hard to find. So, all right. Any last questions in the chat there, Mike, or anything?
Oh, it's now getting scrolled. So everyone's saying thank you. So it kind of.
All right. Well, we're good then. If your question got lost, again, just contact me offline. Thanks so much.
Thanks
Glad.
everybody for joining us. Thank you, Jared, again. Appreciate it. I know it's a big subject, and I know I'm going to hear everyone say, I wish he could have gone into it deeper and farther, but we're just limited on time.
We are. Yeah, I easily could have done a whole day on this and you wouldn't want it, but thanks. Okay. See ya.
Thank you. Bye. Thank you, everybody. Melanie, are you still on? How do we find out about the
Yes, I am.
auto or what AutoCon?
You mentioned that that was going to be happening, and I wondered if that would be a helpful experience for a parent who has multiple children with autism.
If you'll email him, yes, that was an upcoming event that I assume it sounded like he was doing it online, probably through a Zoom. But I'll get you his email and you can email you and I'm sure he can get that out to you.
Perfect. Thank you so much. This was
No
fabulous.
problem.
I appreciate
Thank
it.
you.
Have a good day.
See ya. I'm not sure who this is because it's your code or your username is Genesis Rising. Sorry about the mix up in the time. We will have the slides, and I don't even think they're on here now. Yeah, I can get you a copy of the slides. Just fill out that evaluation form so I know who to email them to. Oh, where is the evaluation form? It is on a Google form. Let me copy the link right here, and then you'll be able to get to it. There you go. And I think I sent it just to you. So let me send it to everybody else. Yeah, if you'll click on that, if it blocks you out, it was probably because you might have a firewall. And you just need to, if you can't open it, email me and I'll send it to you and you can forward it to yourself, or if you can copy and paste and avoid any firewall systems. I know we have quite a few here at the hospital. I have to send it to myself personally all the time, even to give you this link and stuff. I can't access it while I'm here at the hospital. I have to access it at home or some other means, but I hope that'll work. Hope everyone good. Hope everyone has a good day. Look forward to seeing you again.